Violence has flared up in the West Bank again, and Israelis are taking to the streets to protest against their own government. On the eve of its 75th anniversary, Israel is divided like never before. For almost 3 months now, Israelis have been taking to the streets in increasing numbers to demonstrate against the new government. The protesters want to stop controversial reforms to the country's judiciary. They say that if the reforms pass, it will mark the end of democracy here. The protests have largely been peaceful, but as they've grown in size and desperation, there have been clashes with police. Opposition leaders have warned that if they are ignored and if no compromise is found, it could lead to civil war. It's a dramatic statement designed to capture the headlines, but it does speak to the strength of feeling and the growing political divide. And the protests in Israel are happening against a backdrop of increasing violence in the West Bank. The Israeli military has been carrying out raids in Palestinian towns and villages on an almost daily basis to arrest suspected militants and seize weapons. These incursions often turn violent. Already this year, 80 Palestinians and 12 Israelis have died in the violence. Children have also been killed on both sides. Israel's new government is the most right-wing in the country's history. For many years, the Israeli right has wanted to limit the power of the courts. Nationalists are infuriated that judges often limit settlement expansion in the West Bank, and the ultra-Orthodox want to introduce laws that conform with their religious beliefs. Under the reforms, the government of the day will have a virtual veto on any new judges appointed, and will be able to pass laws unchallenged with a simple majority of one in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. But with no written constitution, a largely ceremonial president, and only one house in the parliament, the Supreme Court is seen as the only check on government behaviour. Remove that, and the government could effectively do what it wants. Many Israelis fear the reforms will mean the end of the liberal democracy that they've spent 75 years building.
I want a free speech, I want a free country, I want the same right for every person of every religion, of every nationality.
They believe it will erode human rights, women's rights, and sexual freedoms. Historically, Netanyahu has always been a popular politician. He is Israel's longest-serving leader.
We're afraid that we will become a dictatorship instead of the democracy that we have right now.
You believe Netanyahu's becoming a dictator?
Absolutely.
And if elections were held again today, the opinion polls say that he wouldn't win. There has been criticism from all sectors of Israeli society, orthodox and secular, young and old, right-wing and left-wing. Even some Israeli military reservists have gone on strike. The Israeli currency, the shekel, has weakened, and the usually apolitical and much celebrated tech industry has threatened to pull investment and jobs from the country. International condemnation of the reforms has been widespread, most significantly from Israel's closest ally, the US.
The United States also remains firmly opposed to any acts that could trigger more insecurity, including settlement expansion and inflammatory rhetoric.
At the moment, Netanyahu seems to be beholden to the strong right-wing voices in his coalition. He is currently on trial for charges of fraud and bribery, which he denies. But his critics say he's only pushing through the reforms to get himself out of that trial. The opposition and the Israeli president have both called for a halt in the reforms so discussions can take place. So far, Netanyahu has refused. If he were to pause or water down the reforms, he faces rebellion in his cabinet and possibly the collapse of the coalition. The idea of a two-state solution is something that foreign diplomats and some Palestinians still cling to. The reality, though, is that we are nowhere near that moment right now. The new Israeli government includes senior far-right ministers, who want to build more Israeli settlements in the West Bank and dramatically reduce Palestinian rights. Many young Palestinians have lost hope, have few prospects, and are fed up at Israeli raids into their cities. And so they are taking up arms to challenge the Israeli occupier. This all leads to violent clashes and a seemingly never-ending spiral of death.
With politicians on either side either unwilling or unable to stop it, talk of a new uprising, a third intifada, is growing. Israel is facing a constitutional crisis. If the government pushes ahead with the reforms, and they've showed no sign of slowing down, then they could be challenged in the very courts that they seek to weaken.
Should that happen, and the Supreme Court ultimately find them unlawful, then the Attorney General might be compelled to declare Netanyahu unfit for office, and the civil service, including the police and the military, would have to decide who it obeys, the government or the courts. It could get